Chapter 13. Beyond Human Imagining. The doctor's gambling parlor was located in the basement of one of the city's largest temples, where no one would suspect to find a demon den, or so she claimed. It was certainly the nicest basement Miyuko had ever seen, with gilded walls, exotic hardwood furniture, and dozens of dangling lanterns that cast patterned shadows over Citrusinae's strange assortment of guests, both mortal and spirit. First, there were 6 card players: Citrusine, Geiki, a horn-beam spirit so tall her branches grazed the ceiling, a cloud spirit even smaller than Miyuko, a man with pale blue skin and a habit of dissolving into a small blizzard, and last, a human man dressed entirely in plum. There were plenty of other spirits too, for many of the players had arrived in entourages. Baigana, monkey spirits with red faces and golden fur, goblins, bare-chested ogres, a spider-woman with 6 arms draped in glittering lace, and still more spirits which Miyuko, in her limited experience, could not name. Grimacing uncomfortably, she fidgeted with her new embroidered robes. Thanks to Citrusinae's generosity, she and Geiki had been supplied with baths, fine clothes, and a choice of perfumes ranging from sulphur to sweet cherry. But these accoutrements had only made her feel even more out of place, for they did not suit her. To add insult to injury, her new hairpin, carved from the carapace of some gigantic green beetle, seemed to hold nothing but contempt for her efforts to blend in, for it kept trying to slip stealthily from the girl's knot at the top of her head. Miyuko shoved the traitorous piece of jewelry back into place as she studied the crowd. "Which one do you think is the card sharp?" she whispered to Geiki, who, much to her envy, looked rather handsome in his black robes, the cloth shimmering blue where it caught the lamplight. "It could be anyone," he replied, taking a pastry from one of the doctor's thralls, who were circulating among the crowd with lacquered trays of refreshments. "What about her?" Miyuko nodded towards the cloud spirit, attired in gauzy white robes, who downed a cup of rice wine in a single gulp before beckoning for another. "Beikai's a them, not a her," Geiki said through a mouthful of food, "and no, not a chance." Tilting her head, Miyuko considered the cloud spirit thoughtfully. According to the lore, spirits had always had several genders. In ages past, humans had been equally diverse, but recent centuries had seen the reduction of their genders to male, female, and hei, meaning neither male nor female. Once heisu had had social positions and families like anyone else, but under the rigid cultural strata of the Omaizi, they had been persecuted to the point where they were accepted only in rare corners of Awaran society, such as the priesthood at the House of December. As a result, Miyuko had never met anyone who wasn't a man or a woman, at least not to her knowledge. But she supposed there was much more to the world than she'd experienced in the limited confines of Nihaoi, and indeed even more than that beyond the borders of human imagining. "Shouldn't we suspect everyone?" she asked. "Not Beikai," Geiki scoffed. "They're one of the children of the North Wind. I heard they've even got a big shrine north of Isajila Inlet somewhere. Do you know how powerful they are?" Miyuko surveyed the diminutive spirit, whose cheeks had begun to glow with drink, red as suns in fog. "How powerful?" she asked dubiously. "You know how I'd need to stake a dozen favors for just one of Citrusinae's?" Geiki asked. "Well, I'd need 100 to match one of Beikai's." Miyuko's jaw dropped. 100? She squeaked. "Shh." He stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the cloud spirit. "Don't gawk." Miyuko made a face at him. "I just didn't know a demigod would even deign to be seen with a bird like you." "Hey, you're not so great either, human." As if in agreement, Miyuko's green pin slid down her hair in another attempted escape, but she clapped her hand to the side of her head, thrusting it back into place. Geiki shot her an annoyed glance. "Why are you squirming like that? You're going to attract attention." "No one's paying attention to me," Miyuko answered grumpily. Indeed, between Citrusine, who was beginning to call the players to their seats, and the Baiganasu, who were clambering over the thralls, spilling cups of rice wine and something that looked suspiciously like blood, there was not much reason to notice a human girl like Miyuko. But perhaps she could use that to her advantage. "What's your plan for finding the card sharp?" she whispered as she and Geiki drifted toward the card table. He shrugged. You don't have one? Why bother? They always go wrong. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make one. Miyuko caught her voice rising and quickly yanked it down again. I can help. If I can slip through the crowd unnoticed, maybe I can spot our swindler. Great idea, flashing her a grin. Geiki plopped down on one of the 6 embroidered cushions arranged for the players, where he was joined on one side by the man who wore only plum and on the other side by the spirit who kept turning into a snowstorm. An Odoshoya, Geiki whispered before Miyuko could ask. A demon who preys on travelers, killing them in the cold. Miyuko glanced over at the demon as he transformed back into a pale blue man with a slight paunch and a speckling of gray in his otherwise black hair. How come he can shapeshift when we're watching him? The middle-aged man who's also a blizzard is one of his forms. The other's a lot uglier. I hear he has talons so sharp he can rip you to shreds with the slightest touch. Miyuko gulped. Don't get caught, she murmured. Geiki winked at her. I won't. Once the players were settled, Citrusine positioned herself at one end of the card table, stately as any of the nobility. In fact, so arresting was she in her robes of black and gold that all she had to do was lift one of her hands, and she commanded the attention of the entire room. As the game commenced, Miyuko circled the table. From what she could gather, the rules were fairly straightforward. There was some sort of betting with lacquer tokens, and bluffing seemed particularly important. Although she found the nuances of the game difficult to follow. For his part, Geiki appeared to be a passable player, if somewhat gregarious, which the other players regarded with varying degrees of tolerance, from the hornbeam spirit's creaking chuckle to the frigid glare of the Odoshoya. Moving among the other guests, Miyuko eavesdropped on their conversations, hoping to glean some useful information, but to her disappointment she found nothing of import. One of the human women who accompanied the man in plum was bored. The monkey spirits, nearly as drunk as Baigai, had begun harassing the cloud spirit for refusing to help another troop of Baigana near Baigai's shrine in Izajila. The ogres, predictably, had little of interest to say. Half an hour into the game, Miyuko had discovered nothing useful, and she could feel her hairpin attempting to slip from its place again. Stepping out of the crowd to adjust it, she accidentally elbowed one of the thralls, who was passing with a tray of beverages. The man grunted. The tray went flying. A dozen ceramic cups went cascading to the floor. Miyuko groaned. These were not even the first cups she'd broken this week. The other guests turned to glare at her. So much for escaping notice. Miyuko felt her cheeks go hot. I'm sorry, she said with a quick bow. Please continue. Shrieking with laughter, one of the monkey spirits bowed in imitation. The goblins cackled, thumbing their long red noses. Loudly, the man in plum demanded to know who'd brought her. Plain and clumsy? She ought to be sent away where no one had to stand the sight of her. Some of the others laughed. In her 17 years, Miyuko had wished many times for the gift of melting into the ground, and for a moment, she hoped that the Shauha's curse had gifted her the power to dribble through the floorboards with the spilled wine. But alas, she remained solidly where she was. Then she heard Geiki's voice over the laughter. Try that again. She looked up. The Atsukayakina locked eyes with her, though he did not seem to be addressing her at all. Try that trick again, Baikaijai, and I'll take you for all you've got. I'm on to you now. He held Miyuko's gaze a moment longer before grinning at the cloud spirit and cracking some joke she scarcely heard. Try that again. Did he mean her? Try what exactly? Embarrassing herself? Or interrupting the game? No one was watching her now. They'd all returned their attention to the cards. As one of the goblins passed her, she extended her foot, causing him to stumble into the Baigana, who leapt at him, pulling at his nose and ears. Quickly, she slid between a pair of ogres to avoid suspicion, but no one seemed to have noticed. She glanced at Geiki to see if she'd understood him correctly, but he was focused on the card table, where there was a flash of light. A mirror? No. An illusion of a mirror, winking in and out of existence beside the hornbeam spirit's cards as she turned to stare at the squabbling monkey spirits. Geiki had seized the opportunity to spy on the other player's hands, and she, Miyuko thought with a ripple of excitement, was helping him. As luck would have it, Miyuko was not the only distraction either. One of the human women fainted when an ogre let out a particularly malodorous fart. The goblins began insulting the Odoshoya, who withstood their jibes with a cold reserve, dropping the temperature in the basement so precipitously that for a minute Miyuko could see her breath fogging in the air. Every time their attention was turned, Geiki conjured one of his little mirrors. Every time, Miyuko felt that same thrill of pleasure. Then the hornbeam spirit ran out of tokens. After grabbing one of Sidrusine's thralls and shaking him about like a baby's rattle, she was escorted from the room. Gleefully, the Baiganasu capered after her, some wagging their bottoms at the remaining guests in a sort of vulgar farewell. Worried, Miyuko glanced at Geiki's pile of tokens, which had shrunk to half its original size. If they didn't find the card sharp before he, too, was removed from the game, they'd lose their chance at crossing the bay. Something in his demeanor had changed as well. He was less chatty, more subdued. When he spoke now, his voice had lost its raucous edge. His reserves dropped to 20 tokens, then 17, then 5. By this time, Geiki was not speaking at all, swallowing hard when he glanced at his cards. He caught Miyuko's eye across the table, opening and closing his mouth as if he were a fish. Was he having trouble speaking? His eyes bulged, the tendons at his neck strained. Was he having trouble breathing? No one else seemed to notice, not even the doctor, who was chatting idly with the Spider-Woman. Geiki's hands went to his throat. "Help!" Crying out, Miyuko shoved one of the goblins out of her way, or at least she tried, for instead of pushing him aside, she had tripped over her own feet and tumbled directly into the Odoshoya, who crashed to the floor beneath her. "Oh no," she gasped, blushing. "My deepest But her voice trailed off, for from the sleeve of his robes fluttered an extra set of cards, which alighted on the floor like the last red leaves fluttering onto the snow. Miyuko blinked. She'd done it. She'd found Sidrusine's swindler. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man in plum leapt to his feet, slamming his hands upon the table. "Vakaiha!" he bellowed. "I knew no one could be that lucky.